Welcome to Drama After Dark, where power is coveted, darling, loyalty is fragile, and every secret has a way of finding its way back to the surface, eventually. At South Fork, power is measured in oil, and loyalty is tested at every turn, of course, because in the Ewing family, nothing stays buried for long. And guiding you through it all, dearie, is Miss Kane, with a front row seat to every betrayal, every alliance, and every scandal worth remembering. So don't just watch the drama, darling. Subscribe, and come back every Friday for the scandal.
If you're new here, darling, welcome to Drama After Dark. And if you've been watching with me for a while, well, it's good to see you again. Around here, we revisit the golden age of nighttime soaps, one episode at a time, the power plays, the betrayals, and the spectacularly bad decisions that made these shows absolutely unforgettable. Tonight, we're heading back to South Fork for another chapter of Dallas. So settle in, love. This one gets rather interesting.
At South Fork, disaster arrived wearing a familiar face. With the future of Ewing oil hanging by a thread, one desperate gamble left JR facing the possibility of losing everything he has spent a lifetime building. While panic spread through Dallas, an unlikely hero emerged from within the Ewing family itself, proving that strength often appears when it is needed most. Elsewhere, old loyalties continued to shift. Sue Ellen found herself caught between the life she has always known and the possibility of something entirely different, while Bobby and Pam discovered that some battles are easier to face when standing together. And as one crisis begins to settle, new opportunities are quietly taking shape beyond the gates of South Fork. The dust may be settling, darling, but the story is far from over. This is Drama After Dark.
Miss Ellie, bless her heart, has spent the better part of the morning sitting on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by old letters, cards, and childhood drawings. The same record keeps playing over and over again, filling South Fork with a song nobody downstairs can escape. And judging by JR's face, nobody is suffering more than he is. While the family picks at breakfast on the patio, JR finally demands to know why Miss Ellie insists on playing that particular song on repeat. Lucy, bless her heart, is more than happy to provide the answer. It's Gary's birthday. Well, that explains everything, doesn't it? Unfortunately, explaining something and getting JR to respect it are two very different things. Before long, he's rattling off Gary's greatest failures as if he's reading quarterly earnings. According to JR, their brother is an alcoholic, a gambler, and a man who never amounted to much. Lucy nearly launches herself across the breakfast table. Darling, Bobby isn't exactly charmed by the speech either. In fact, Bobby is quick to remind his older brother that a person's value isn't determined by how much money they make or how many oil wells they own, a lesson JR has somehow managed to avoid learning his entire life. Thankfully, Jock steps in before somebody wears their breakfast. The family patriarch has no interest in another Ewing argument this morning. His focus is upstairs, where he knows Miss Ellie is struggling. Of all the days in the year, Gary's birthday is the one that leaves the deepest mark. After the others head off to school and work, Jock finds his wife exactly where she started the morning, surrounded by memories of the son she misses more than she can admit. When Miss Ellie quietly says she wants Gary home, it's enough to break your heart, isn't it? But Jock doesn't share her optimism. He reminds her that even if they could find Gary, he probably wouldn't come back. And if he did, he'd only do what he's always done when life becomes difficult: run. It's a harsh assessment, but coming from Jock Ewing, it's also an honest one. Miss Ellie sees the son she loves. Jock sees the son who never stayed long enough to become the man he wanted him to be. While the rest of South Fork is focused on Gary, JR is busy preparing for a weekend away with Kristen. Now, under ordinary circumstances, a married man taking a trip with his secretary, well, that might raise a few eyebrows. But the fact that said secretary also happens to be his wife's younger sister? Oh, darling, that tends to raise considerably more. Sue Ellen certainly notices the irony. As JR packs his bags, she pointedly remarks that she hopes he and Kristen manage to find time for a little fun between all that very important business. JR responds exactly the way you'd expect, with complete confidence and absolutely no shame. When Sue Ellen reminds him that Dallas is well aware of his relationship with her sister, JR dismisses the whole thing with a straight face, insisting that only someone with a filthy mind would assume there's anything improper going on. Darling, when a man starts defending himself before anyone has actually accused him, that's usually a sign. Still, the conversation takes an interesting turn when Sue Ellen hints that she may spend the weekend being every bit as discreet as her husband. Suddenly, JR becomes much more interested in the subject of fidelity. Funny how that works, isn't it? Meanwhile, down in the foyer, Lucy is making final preparations for her trip to Houston and a long-awaited visit with her mother. But despite her excitement, the mood inside South Fork has clearly gotten to her. When Miss Ellie joins her, the conversation quickly returns to Gary. Lucy admits she has no idea where her father is, and for a moment, Miss Ellie seems disappointed. Then she learns that Lucy is on her way to meet Valene. Now that gets her attention. If anyone might know where Gary is, it's the woman who once knew him best. The moment Miss Ellie hears Valene's name, a plan begins to form. She asks Lucy to arrange a meeting, but quickly decides that isn't enough. No phone call, no message, no waiting. She's going herself. And after spending the entire morning mourning the son she can't find, Miss Ellie has no intention of letting anyone stand in her way. Lucy barely has time to greet her mother before explaining why Miss Ellie is standing beside her. Not that Valene seems particularly surprised. No, if anything, she's genuinely happy to see her former mother-in-law. And Miss Ellie, well, she wastes very little time getting to the point. For years, the family has talked about Gary as though he's either a disappointment or a problem to be solved, darling. But sitting across from Valene, Miss Ellie reveals something much simpler. She misses her son. More than that, she needs him. In a rare moment of honesty, she admits that Gary has always occupied a different place in her heart than Bobby or JR. The other two may have inherited Jock's strength and determination, but Gary has always been different. And perhaps that's exactly why she worries about him. Unfortunately, Valene doesn't have many answers. Gary still calls from time to time, but he never says where he is and never stays in one place for very long. The only thing she can promise is that the next time he calls, she'll pass along Miss Ellie's message. Not a demand, not an ultimatum, just a mother asking to see her son. And considering how Gary was treated the last time he was at South Fork, Miss Ellie is even willing to meet him somewhere else. Imagine that! Back at South Fork, Sue Ellen receives a phone call that may prove far more entertaining than she expected. The caller is Rudy Millington, Kristen's occasionally discarded boyfriend, who has just arrived in Dallas and is looking for her. Unfortunately for Rudy, Kristen is currently away for the weekend. Fortunately for Sue Ellen, she knows exactly where. Without missing a beat, she informs him that Kristen is traveling with JR and even provides the name of their hotel. Oh, honey. Now, Sue Ellen never directly tells Rudy to drive to Austin and interrupt their little getaway. That would be rude. She merely suggests that Kristen might appreciate a visit. Darling, sometimes the most effective revenge is simply giving the right person the right information and letting nature take its course. Well, it turns out Valene knows a little more about Gary's whereabouts than she let on. The moment she returns home, we discover that the birthday boy himself is sitting in her apartment. Unfortunately, this reunion is anything but romantic. Valene has spent months waiting for Gary to decide what he wants, and she's finally running out of patience. While she's been trying to build a future, Gary has been doing what Gary does best, keeping one foot out the door. This time, the door leads to California. Gary reveals that an old employer has offered him a job in Gardenia, and he's seriously considering taking it. The problem isn't the job. The problem is that, once again, he's making plans without considering the people who love him. Valene points out that they were finally making progress. Gary has been spending more time with her, and they had agreed to take things slowly before bringing Lucy back into his life. But slowly and nowhere are two very different things. Valene wants a commitment. Gary wants more time. And judging by the look on her face, she's tired of hearing it. The conversation becomes even more complicated when Valene tells him about Miss Ellie's visit. Gary immediately retreats. The mere thought of seeing his mother seems to trigger every old fear he has about the Ewing family. To Gary, South Fork isn't home. It's pressure, it's expectations. It's a lifetime of being compared to JR and Bobby, and feeling as though he came up short. Even when Valene insists that Miss Ellie only wants to see her son, Gary can't bring himself to believe it. As always, his solution is distance. A little more time, a little more waiting, a little more running. When the conversation reaches an impasse, Gary heads for the door, promising he'll call. It's a promise Valene has heard before. As he walks away, she quietly wishes him a happy birthday. And somehow that's sadder than if she'd yelled. While Gary is trying to leave Texas behind, JR is, settling into a weekend that is supposed to be all pleasure and no business. After arriving at a luxury hotel with Kristen, JR proudly shows off the accommodations, reminding her that nothing but the best will do. Kristen, however, hasn't forgotten that their arrival was delayed because JR simply had to stop and visit a wealthy business associate along the way. So much for leaving work at the office. Honestly, to be fair, JR does make an effort. When Kristen reminds him that he promised her a business-free weekend, he quickly shifts gears and assures her that she has his full attention. Darling, whenever JR Ewing starts talking about giving someone his undivided attention, you should probably check your wallet afterwards. Just saying. Still, the couple heads off to enjoy their getaway, completely unaware that their peaceful weekend is already beginning to unravel. Back in Dallas, Bobby receives a surprise that is considerably more welcome. After being told that someone has arrived with coffee and donuts, Bobby assumes it's just another interruption in an already busy day. Instead, he comes face to face with the one person he never expected to see standing in the offices of Ewing Oil. Gary. And judging by Bobby's reaction, Christmas may have arrived early. The reunion between the brothers is warm, genuine, and completely free of the competition that seems to infect every other Ewing relationship. Bobby is thrilled to see him, but his excitement quickly gives way to concern when Gary explains that he only stopped by to say goodbye before leaving Dallas. Immediately, Bobby knows there's one person Gary cannot leave without seeing: Miss Ellie. And unlike JR or Jock, Bobby isn't interested in debating Gary's shortcomings. He simply knows what his mother's been going through. The problem, of course, is convincing Gary to walk back into a family he's spent years trying to escape. Back at South Fork, the mood inside the house has changed considerably. Sue Ellen is relaxing in the living room with a book when Miss Ellie finally returns home, carrying shopping bags, and, for the first time all day, a little bit of energy. Jock immediately wants to know where she's been, clearly having spent part of the afternoon searching for her. Miss Ellen offers very few details. Instead, she's focused on dinner. A very special dinner. Now, under ordinary circumstances, that wouldn't mean much, but considering the way she's been grieving over Gary all day, the sudden improvement in her mood is enough to raise a few eyebrows. Moments later, the reason becomes clear. The phone rings. It's Bobby, and after confirming that Miss Ellie is alone, he hands the phone to someone she hasn't heard from in far too long: Gary. The transformation is immediate. 1 second she's Miss Ellie Ewing, matriarch of South Fork. The next she's simply a mother hearing her son's voice. For the first time all day, hope replaces heartbreak. Gary reveals that he's in Dallas and wants to see her. Better yet, he already has a plan. Bobby will bring Miss Ellie to meet him the following morning, though he asks her to keep the visit a secret from Lucy. Naturally, Miss Ellie agrees to whatever terms are necessary. At that moment, she's not interested in negotiations. She's just relieved. After spending the entire day wondering if she'd ever see Gary again, she finally has something she hasn't had in a very long time: tomorrow. If Kristen was hoping for a romantic dinner, well, she clearly forgot one very important fact about JR Ewing. For JR, darling, every room is a business opportunity. The couple has barely arrived at the restaurant before JR spots Eugene Bullock, a wealthy tanker owner whose fortune is large enough to stop even JR in his tracks. Despite promising Kristen an entire weekend free from business, he immediately abandons those plans and rushes over to introduce himself. Darling, some men can't help themselves. What follows is one of the more uncomfortable dinner conversations you'll ever witness. JR introduces Kristen as his secretary and right hand, only to discover that Bullock has recently married his own former assistant, Sally. And unlike most people in Dallas, Eugene Bullock has absolutely no interest in pretending appearances mean anything. When asked why she married him, Sally answers with a single word: money. No hesitation, no embarrassment, no performance. Just honesty. Bullock seems delighted by it. In fact, he appears far more amused by the arrangement than offended by it. Having apparently given up on romance years ago, he openly praises Sally for telling the truth and suggests that more people should do the same. Then his attention turns to Kristen, and suddenly, the conversation becomes much more personal. Bullock takes one look at JR and Kristen together and immediately assumes they're having an affair. Kristen quickly explains that JR is actually married to her older sister and that she's merely his secretary. A clarification that somehow makes the situation sound worse instead of better. Bullock remains unconvinced, offering one final piece of advice. When he gives advice, smart people take it. JR, naturally, raises his glass. Because when a wealthy man is talking, JR Ewing rarely argues, even when the wealthy man is calling him out to his face. Back in Dallas, Gary finds himself standing outside Valene's door once again. Apparently, even Gary realizes that disappearing on your birthday isn't the most effective way to win back the woman you love. This time, he arrives with a different attitude. It's his birthday, and he thinks maybe the occasion deserves a little celebration. Considering how their last conversation ended, well, that's actually a promising development. Meanwhile, down in Austin, JR is proving that some habits simply cannot be broken. What was supposed to be a romantic weekend with Kristen has turned into yet another business opportunity. JR continues pitching his oil deal to Eugene Bullock and his new wife Sally, only to discover that Sally isn't merely accompanying her husband these days. Oh no, honey, she's running the business. Eugene makes it perfectly clear that anyone hoping to do business with him now has to go through Sally first. And that piece of information immediately gets JR's full attention. After all, a wealthy businessman is useful. But the person controlling the wealthy businessman's money, well, darling, that's even more useful. Sally seems intrigued by the proposal but isn't ready to commit. She wants more information, more numbers, and more assurances before making any decisions. Naturally, JR is more than willing to provide them. Eventually, Eugene decides he's heard enough for one evening. Before heading off to bed, however, he leaves the table with one final observation. JR and Sally are welcome to continue their negotiations, and Eugene places particular emphasis on the word negotiate. Darling, old age may slow a man down, but it doesn't necessarily make him less observant. The moment Eugene leaves, JR practically sends Kristen away. He insists she'll be bored by all the business talk and encourages her to get some sleep while he continues working on Sally. Nothing says romantic getaway quite like being dismissed so your date can chase a business deal, now does it? Rather than head upstairs, Kristen wanders into the hotel bar, where she receives an unexpected surprise. Rudy Millington. Thanks to Sue Ellen's helpful directions, finding Kristen wasn't difficult at all. Rudy wastes no time reminding her that she's involved with a married man. More specifically, a married man whose wife happens to be Kristen's own sister. It's reality Kristen clearly doesn't enjoy having thrown back in her face. The conversation quickly turns into a contest between ambition and affection. Rudy offers a future, a successful career, and a life they've talked about building together. Kristen responds with a reminder that JR's world operates on a completely different financial scale. According to her, JR spends more on tips than Rudy expects to earn in a year. Honey, that's got to leave a mark. Still, Rudy refuses to believe money is the whole story. He insists she misses him, misses what they had, and sooner or later she'll remember it. Kristen denies everything. Rudy doesn't believe a word of it. And as the evening comes to a close, one thing becomes very clear. Sue Ellen's little phone call is already causing far more trouble than anyone realizes.
The drama sparkles best when you're part of it. Subscribe and stay close, like a whispered secret. Leave a comment, tell us what has you gasping, because every scandal deserves an audience.
The next morning begins with Sue Ellen enjoying one of the few pleasures available to a neglected wife. gloating. Alone at South Fork, she finds herself speaking to a photograph of JR, happily informing it that Gary is back in Dallas. Considering how much JR enjoys controlling family information, there's something wonderfully satisfying about him being the last person to know. Meanwhile, Bobby brings Miss Ellie to the offices of Ewing Oil for a reunion she's been dreaming about ever since Gary's birthday began. The moment she sees her son, all the disappointment, worry, and frustration of the past year seems to disappear. For a little while, they're simply mother and son again. As the conversation unfolds, Miss Ellie admits that she finally understands something she couldn't accept before. Trying to force Gary back under the South Fork roof was never going to solve anything. The problem was never where Gary lived. The problem was expecting him to become someone he wasn't. Gary, in turn, opens up more than he usually does. He acknowledges that he was never comfortable carrying the weight of responsibility the rest of the family seemed to handle so naturally. And while Jock might see that as weakness, Miss Ellie sees something entirely different. A son who has spent most of his life underestimating himself. Eventually, the conversation turns to Valene. Miss Ellie learns that Gary and Valene have quietly been rebuilding their relationship for more than a year. She naturally assumes they must have plans for the future, but Gary's answer is less certain. There have been discussions about remarriage and a possible move to California, but Gary remains hesitant. Not because he doesn't love Valene, because he's terrified of disappointing her, again. For perhaps the first time in his life, Gary openly admits that he doesn't want to make promises he can't keep. He's tired of hurting Valene, tired of hurting Lucy, tired of hurting the people who care about him. And that's when Miss Ellie says exactly what he needs to hear. Nobody expects him to be perfect. They simply want him to be part of their lives. It's a simple statement, a mother's statement, and somehow it changes everything. Because moments later, in one of the most unexpected developments of the season, Gary turns to Valene and asks her to marry him. Just like that. No grand speech, no elaborate plan. Just Gary deciding, perhaps for the first time, to stop running from the future. A delighted Miss Ellie immediately calls Bobby back into the room to share the news. And judging by the smile on Bobby's face, there may not be a happier person in Dallas that morning. The very next morning, darling, Kristen discovers that JR has already started his day without her. Can you believe it? After learning that he left no message, she eventually finds him exactly where she should have expected to find him, sitting in the lounge with Sally Bullock. Oh, the nerve! So much for that tennis date. Honestly. When Kristen reminds him they had plans, JR barely looks up from his business conversation. He assures her they'll still play tennis eventually, just as soon as he finishes discussing a few things with Sally. A few things. Darling, whenever JR Ewing says a few things, prepare to lose the rest of your day. Kristen is clearly irritated, and honestly, who can blame her? She came all the way to Austin expecting a romantic weekend, and has instead spent most of her time watching JR chase a business deal. Not only that, he's chasing it through Sally, who now controls Eugene Bullock's business affairs and has become the person JR needs to impress. Even Sally notices attention. When she jokingly describes Kristen as a demanding secretary, JR responds by calling her useful. Not beautiful, not charming, useful. Nothing says romance quite like being described as office equipment. Kristen may smile through the exchange, but she's clearly had enough, and moments later she makes a decision. Instead of waiting around for JR to remember she exists, she asks for her car and quietly requests directions to the St. Francis Motel, the same motel where Rudy Millington is staying. Now that's interesting. Because for the first time all weekend, Kristen appears to have found something she'd rather do than wait for JR Ewing. Well, now, with the proposal accepted, the race is truly on, darling. Bobby, bless his heart, immediately starts making arrangements, calling in favors and pulling strings to ensure Gary and Valene can be married as quickly as possible. Between judges, licenses, blood tests, and all that paperwork, Bobby seems absolutely determined to make up for every single year his brother spent away from the family. Miss Ellie, meanwhile, has moved on to a much more important responsibility: shopping. After waiting nearly 2 decades to see Gary and Valene reunite, she has no intention of showing up empty-handed. Oh no. In fact, she's already talking about weddings, presents, and celebrations before the couple has even made it to the courthouse. Darling, once Miss Ellie decides you're getting married, resistance is absolutely futile. As Gary and Valene leave to take care of their blood tests, Bobby offers to take his mother to lunch before heading back to Southfolk to get ready for the ceremony. And along the way, a casual conversation reveals that Bobby has been investing in homes in California with Steve Wiley to help finance construction projects back in Texas. Now, most people would overlook that little detail, but I certainly would not. Back Back at Southfork, Sue Ellen is once again settled in the living room with a book in hand when Miss Ellie and Bobby rush through the house, preparing for the afternoon ahead. Jock, however, has finally reached the very end of his patience. After 2 days of secret meetings, mysterious disappearances, and whispered conversations, he wants answers. And honestly, he has a point, doesn't he? When Miss Ellie just brushes him off and hurries upstairs to finish getting ready, Bobby is left to explain what's been happening. And, darling, the news lands like a thunderbolt. Gary and Valene are getting married. Again. Unfortunately, the announcement doesn't produce the reaction Bobby was quite hoping for. Instead of celebrating, Jock immediately falls back into the same argument that's followed Gary for years. He insists he loved his son, but he also insists Gary never had the courage to stand his ground when life became difficult. To Jock, Gary has always run from adversity, but to Bobby, this wedding proves quite the opposite. For perhaps the very first time in his life, Gary is choosing responsibility instead of escape. Bobby urges his father to attend the ceremony, but Jock refuses. Oh yes, in his mind, he's already seen this story before. The difference is that Bobby still believes his brother can change. Before heading upstairs, Bobby quietly leaves the address behind, just in case Jock changes his mind. A few moments later, Miss Ellie comes downstairs, dressed and ready to go. When Bobby tells her that he informed Jock about the wedding, she's disappointed. After all, she had promised Gary she would keep the ceremony private. Still, she wants to know how Jock reacted, and the answer is exactly what she expected. He isn't coming. As Bobby and Miss Ellie prepare to leave for the wedding, she can't help but reflect on how hard Jock has always been on Gary. Bobby remembers it too, and somewhere behind her book, Sue Ellen is hearing every single word of it. At Southfork, information travels almost as fast as gossip, darling. Well now, back in Austin, JR's persistence is finally beginning to pay off. After listening to his pitch, Sally admits she's convinced the deal makes sense. The only remaining obstacle is Eugene. Fortunately, she also reveals exactly what's standing in the way. Eugene never quite forgave JR for outbidding him on a prized Remington statue, a slight he apparently remembers to this day. JR immediately sees a solution. Darling, if there's one thing JR understands, it's that business is often less about contracts and more about knowing which ego needs stroking. Confident that the deal is all but secured, JR places a call back to Southfork to arrange delivery of the statue. And fortunately for him, the person who answers the phone is Sue Ellen. And Sue Ellen has been waiting for this moment all day. When JR asks what's going on at home, she takes her time enjoying herself before casually dropping a bombshell. Gary is back in Dallas. Not only that, he's marrying Valene this afternoon. The reaction is immediate. Suddenly, the oil deal, the weekend getaway, and the bullocks are the furthest things from JR's mind. Now, under normal circumstances, one might assume JR is rushing home because he's overjoyed that his brother has found happiness. One would be wrong. JR has spent years viewing Gary as the weak link in the Ewing family chain. The idea of Gary settling down, getting remarried, and potentially building a stable life clearly rattles him far more than he'd ever admit. Meanwhile, Sue Ellen couldn't be more pleased with herself. After all, she didn't ruin JR's weekend. She merely informed him of current events. What he chose to do with that information is entirely his problem. With no time to waste, JR abandons his negotiations with Sally and announces he's heading back to Dallas immediately. The only problem is that his transportation has suddenly become complicated. Because Kristen is gone. The hotel staff informs him that Miss Shepherd left some time ago after asking for directions to the St. Francis Motel. Unable to find a limousine, a rental car, or anything else with four wheels, JR does what JR always does in a crisis. He commandeers someone else's transportation. Before long, he's racing toward the motel, determined to find Kristen before she creates another problem he doesn't need. And considering the day he's already having, that's saying something. Now, back at Valene's apartment, final wedding preparations are well underway, honey. In the bedroom, Valene shows Miss Ellie the dress she has carefully saved all these years. To Miss Ellie's surprise, it's the very same dress she wore when she married Gary the first time. 17 years later, she's about to wear it again. Now, darling, that's either incredibly romantic or a sign that Valene has far more faith than the rest of us. Miss Ellie, bless her heart, thinks it's just perfect. Meanwhile, Gary and Bobby are waiting in the living room when Miss Ellie decides it's time to reveal her wedding presents. The first surprise is a pair of airline tickets to California. The second? Well, that's considerably larger. A house! Or, more specifically, whichever California house Gary and Valene choose. The offer leaves both of them absolutely speechless. Gary immediately tries to refuse. He and Valene want to build their new life on their own terms, they say. They don't want to depend on anyone. But this isn't really about real estate, is it? No, honey, it's about guilt. For perhaps the first time, Miss Ellie openly admits how badly Gary and Valene were treated over the years. She reminds them that when they were struggling to build a life together and raise Lucy, the Ewing family made that nearly impossible. And while she loves her granddaughter with all her heart, she confesses something she's carried for years. She should have fought harder for them. The house isn't meant to erase the past, darling. It can't. It's simply a mother trying to give her son a better future than the one he was allowed before. Then comes a knock at the door. And suddenly, nobody is thinking about houses anymore, because standing on the other side is Jock Ewing. After refusing Bobby's invitation, after insisting Gary would never change, after spending years criticizing nearly every decision his son ever made, Jock has come, not with an apology, not with excuses, just with a simple request. He believes he has a son getting married today, and if he's welcome, he'd like to attend. For a moment, Gary seems genuinely surprised. Then he smiles, and for perhaps the first time in years, father and son meet somewhere in the middle. Gary tells him he's glad he came. Jock wishes him luck. It's not a grand reconciliation, darling. It's something better. It's a beginning. While one Ewing wedding is, darling, bringing people together, another Ewing is, oh, busy destroying a relationship. Over at the St. Francis Motel, Rudy is making one final attempt to convince Kristen that what they once had is worth saving. Despite all her talk about money, status, and JR, Ewing, it's becoming increasingly obvious that Rudy still loves her, and judging by the way Kristen responds, part of her may still love him too. Unfortunately, they run out of time, because JR has finally tracked her down. After racing across Austin, he arrives at the motel room and immediately takes control of the situation. He doesn't ask questions. He doesn't demand explanations. He simply tells Kristen to get dressed, because they're leaving. Now, most men would probably be angry. JR appears entertained. Darling, that's usually much worse. What follows is one of the coldest displays of power we've seen from him in quite some time. Rudy insists that he and Kristen are in love. JR counters by pointing out that Kristen is putting her clothes on and preparing to leave with him. A brutal argument, made even worse because it's true. Then JR decides to make an example out of Rudy. Using nothing more than a telephone and a few carefully chosen words, he calls Rudy's employer and effectively destroys the young man's banking career. Before the conversation is over, Rudy's reputation has been shredded, his future is hanging by a thread, and every opportunity he thought he had worked for may have vanished. All because he dared to challenge JR. Ewing. The frightening part isn't how quickly JR does it, it's how easily. There's no hesitation, no guilt, no second thoughts. just pure retaliation. Even Kristen is disturbed by what she's watching. She tries to share the blame, insisting that Rudy wasn't solely responsible for what happened between them. JR isn't interested. In his version of events, Kristen is innocent and Rudy is the villain. A convenient narrative, especially since it allows JR to punish the man without ever examining his own behavior. When it's over, Rudy asks Kristen the only question that really matters. Is this what she wants? And after everything that's happened, after watching JR dismantle a man's future with a single phone call, Kristen still chooses him. At least for now. As Rudy watches them leave together, one thing becomes painfully clear. Falling in love with Kristen Shepherd may have just cost him everything. Well, darling, as it turns out, JR does make it back to Dallas. But oh, not in time. When he arrives at Valene's apartment, Bobby is just waiting at the door and simply can't resist taking a little jab at his older brother. After all that rushing around, that long drive from Austin, and all the drama involving Kristen, JR has missed the main event. Gary and Valene are already married. It's legal, it's official, and, honey, it's beyond anyone's ability to stop. Darling, that's just got to sting. Inside the apartment, the mood couldn't be more different from the tension JR left behind in Austin. The ceremony is over, the family is celebrating, and for the first time in a very long while, Gary is the center of attention. Even Jock seems determined to keep the peace. In fact, she's the one who encourages JR to congratulate his brother. And, surprisingly, JR does exactly that. Well, darling, in his own way. He starts by kissing the bride and congratulating Valene before turning his attention to Gary. Then comes the performance. JR warmly congratulates his brother and claims he wishes he'd arrived in time for the ceremony. Now, unless I've completely misunderstood J.R. Ewing after 3 seasons, that statement has nothing to do with witnessing the wedding. No, honey, J.R. wishes he'd arrived in time to stop it. Because really, the last thing he expected was Gary actually following through on something. But for once, J.R. is just too late. The wedding is over, the papers are signed. And whether J.R. likes it or not, Gary and Valene Ewing are husband and wife again. A short time later, Bobby accompanies Gary and Valene to California to see the wedding gift Miss Ellie promised them. And suddenly, darling, everything becomes real. For years, Gary and Valene have talked about building a life together. Now they're standing in front of a house that's actually theirs. Not South Fork, not a temporary stop along the way. A home, their home. As they walk through the property, Valene can barely contain her excitement. Gary seems impressed as well, though he's careful not to show quite as much enthusiasm. Some habits die hard, don't they? When Valene asks the name of the community, Gary finally says the words that will change everything. Knots Landing. Remember that name, darling. We're gonna be hearing it quite a bit. Back at South Fork, Sue Ellen finds JR in a particularly foul mood. And honestly, she's enjoying it. When JR demands to know why nobody informed him about Gary's wedding plans, Sue Ellen calmly points out that perhaps she no longer cares who controls every move made at South Fork. Or perhaps she simply enjoys watching JR fail to get his way. Either answer feels entirely possible, wouldn't you say? At first, JR insists that, if he loses, Sue Ellen loses too. It's the kind of threat he's made for years, based on the assumption that everyone around him shares his priorities. But Sue Ellen doesn't seem especially concerned, does she? Then she casually mentions one final detail. Gary and Valene aren't moving to South Fork. They're moving to California. And suddenly everything changes. The irritation disappears. The anger vanishes. In fact, JR practically lights up. Because the truth finally becomes obvious. JR never objected to Gary getting married. He objected to Gary getting married at South Fork. A settled Gary is dangerous enough. A settled Gary living under the same roof, rebuilding relationships with Miss Ellie, Bobby, Lucy, and perhaps even earning Jock's respect again. That could eventually become a problem. But a Gary living halfway across the country? Now that's a different story. By the end of the conversation, JR is practically shopping for wedding gifts. California, after all, is a very long way from Dallas. And that's exactly where JR prefers his brothers.
And so, darling, Gary Ewing, Finally gets something that has eluded him for most of his life. A second chance. A second chance with Valene. A second chance with his family. And perhaps most importantly, a second chance with himself. But while South Fork celebrates a wedding, my attention keeps drifting west. To a quiet cul-de-sac. To a neighborhood called Knott's Landing. Because something tells me Gary Ewing's story isn't ending there. I suspect it's only beginning. As for me, I've already started gathering the files. New neighbors, new friendships, new rivalries. And a few familiar faces that some of you may recognize. I've even enlisted a little local help to keep an eye on things for me. Don't worry. You'll meet him soon enough. Until then, I'll keep the records. And we'll follow Gary Ewing together into the next chapter. Good night, darling.